The story began not with snow, nor silence, nor the gentle rhythm of Pinebrook mornings, but with a sentence sharp enough to split the air. "You're too old for love, Evelyn. Don't embarrass yourself." The words were not whispered. They were delivered with casual certainty, the kind of statement that assumed agreement before anyone had the chance to disagree. They landed in the center of the Pinebrook Village Community Hall during the annual winter gathering, where banners sagged slightly from their tape, and the scent of cinnamon tea hovered warmly above mismatched folding chairs. Evelyn Carter had been mid-conversation when it happened, or rather, mid-listening, which was her truer talent. Her hands, dusted lightly with flour from the pies she had baked that morning, were folded politely in front of her. The remark came from Mrs. Dalloway, a woman whose voice always carried a self-appointed authority, crisp and practical like the creases in her blazer. Evelyn felt her body still before her mind caught up, the kind of stillness that arrives instinctively, like winter icing over a pond in the night. She did not gasp. She did not blink dramatically. She simply stopped being part of the moment. Around her the hall continued breathing. Chairs shifted. Someone laughed at a separate joke. A kettle clicked off. The world did not pause to acknowledge the injury. Social cruelty, when delivered without theatrics, often disguises itself as truth, and truth, people believe, does not require defending. Evelyn's first thought was not indignation. It was an old, familiar sorrow. Too old. The phrase echoed softly, not loud like a gong, but persistent like the tick of a clock you stopped hearing long ago. She had been called old before, affectionately, dismissively, sympathetically, but never had the word been used to exile her from possibility itself. Her second thought was Thomas. Not his death, that was not where her mind traveled first anymore. It went to his hands, paint-flecked and gentle, holding her face the night before their wedding as he said, "There is no age where a heart expires, Evie, only ages where it deepens." He had believed it. She had believed it. The town had believed it then. But grief had quietly rewritten their expectations for her without ever asking her to contribute a sentence. Now the town was older too, but only Evelyn was considered finished. She smiled reflexively because politeness had always been her first shield. "Oh, I don't know that I was suggesting," she began, but the sentence dissolved before it formed, because she had not been suggesting anything at all. Someone else had assigned desire to her simply to dismiss it publicly. A small quiet rippled through the nearest circle of listeners, not discomfort, not outrage, recognition. A subtle group nod. The cruelty had found fertile ground because it confirmed a belief already quietly held. A teenage girl near the refreshment table glanced up, startled. "That was harsh," she murmured to her friend. Her friend shrugged without looking. "People say true things harshly sometimes." Evelyn heard that too. So did someone else. At the far side of the hall, half hidden by the coat rack where scarves and wool hats drooped like tired creatures, a man paused in the act of hanging his gloves. Arthur Bennett had not intended to eavesdrop. He had intended only to warm his hands. But pain, when spoken aloud, does not ask permission before being witnessed. Arthur looked up just in time to see Evelyn smile, the one that did not reach her eyes. He had only recently arrived in Pinebrook, but he already understood the town's unspoken hierarchy of whose stories were allowed to continue. He did not know Evelyn's past yet, but he recognized the shape of restrained grief. He carried a similar silhouette inside himself. No one else in the hall noticed the moment stretching thin around her. But Arthur did. He saw the fractional tightening of her shoulders, the micro-hesitation before she reached for a fallen napkin, the way she gently redirected the conversation toward the dessert raffle as if her own heart had never entered the dialogue at all. Arthur did not intervene. Not yet. Not here. Not in the way young heroes intervene in stories that resolve in minutes. Instead, he remembered her face. The hall eventually swallowed the moment whole, the way snow absorbs footprints if you wait long enough. Evelyn excused herself soon after, carrying an empty pie dish that she washed even though it was already clean. Outside, the evening was brittle with cold. Her breath formed small clouds, visible evidence that she was still a living thing. Yet inside the hall, her heart had been spoken of like an antique object no longer fit for warmth, for disruption, for wonder. Arthur stepped outside a minute later. Not following her, that would have been too intentional, too theatrical for the quiet gravity of this story. He simply found himself on the same stone path, his boots crunching lightly over salt-scattered pavement. Ahead of him, Evelyn paused beneath a street lamp. Not crying, not waiting to be rescued. Just standing, steady, quiet. A woman who had survived a lifetime without demanding applause for it. Arthur did not know it then, but that was the moment his role in her story truly began. And hers unexpectedly in his. But Pinebrook still believed her heart had spoken its last line. And tonight she almost believed them. Before we continue, if stories like this matter to you, please consider subscribing. I spent countless hours crafting this story carefully, and your support helps me keep telling stories that remind us kindness still exists. Evelyn Carter had never considered herself remarkable, which was precisely why she was. She moved through the world with a practiced economy of presence, not shrinking, but not claiming more space than necessary. At 72, she carried the posture of someone who had spent decades balancing grace and responsibility in equal measure. Her spine remained straight not because she feared aging, but because life had demanded steadiness from her early, and she had agreed without complaint. Most mornings she woke before the sun touched Pinebrook Village. The house was always quietest then, not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of memory. She would sit at the edge of her bed for a moment, inhaling the faint scent of lavender sachets she still placed in her drawers. Lavender had been Thomas's favorite, not because it was soothing, but because it was stubborn, one of the few fragrances that lingered even in winter. She liked that about it. Evelyn dressed slowly, deliberately. A knitted cream cardigan, iron trousers, leather shoes polished even when no one would inspect them. There was competence in the ritual, dignity in the repetition. It was her quiet way of reminding the world that she was not dissolving, not surrendering, not retreating from life even if life had retreated from her. She brewed her tea the same way every day. Loose-leaf Earl Grey, steeped exactly 4 minutes, a splash of milk added only after the bag was removed. Precision mattered to her, not for control, but because grief had taught her that when large things break, small structures keep you alive. She sipped from a porcelain cup with hand-painted forget-me-nots, a cup Thomas had given her on their 10th anniversary after attending a local artisan market. He had admired the imperfect symmetry of the flowers, the fact that no two petals matched exactly, yet the pattern still held together. Like us, he had said then. She did not disagree. After tea, she stepped outside to tend the community flower beds, an unofficial responsibility she had made official through consistency. The beds ran along the library's stone walkway, curling gently around the entrance like a living welcome mat. Pinebrook residents assumed the town council managed them. The council assumed the library volunteers did. The volunteers assumed the winter maintenance crew did. In truth, the gardens were Evelyn's quiet inheritance. She knelt without strain despite the cold, despite the stiffness that occasionally whispered in her joints. Her fingers worked with gentle authority, pruning stems, adjusting soil, plucking stray weeds that dared to interrupt the choreography of blooms. She never rushed. Flowers could not be hurried. Healing could not be hurried. The two had become entwined philosophies inside her. Competence first, emotion later always. After Thomas passed, people admired her resilience in practical terms. She keeps busy, they said approvingly, mistaking motion for closure. They praised her reliability, pies for fundraisers, blankets for winter drives, stamps organized for the Historical Society. but no one praised the more difficult endurance. The fact that she continued offering kindness even when kindness had stopped circling back to her. She did not give to be thanked. She gave because a world without giving was a world she could not survive inside. Her volunteer calendar was full not because she feared emptiness, but because emptiness had once almost swallowed her whole and she had negotiated a treaty with it. I will not feed you. It worked mostly. At 9:00 a.m. each day, she opened the Pinebrook Library doors alongside Ms. Rowan, a younger librarian who admired Evelyn deeply but spoke her admiration sparingly, sensing that praise, if too loud, might embarrass the older woman who preferred usefulness to spotlight. Evelyn cataloged returned books, reshelved novels, wiped tables, and restocked stationery. She knew the exact number of pens left in the supply drawer at any given time. She remembered which children preferred adventure novels and which preferred astronomy. She memorized the elderly patrons' reading habits too. Mr. Callahan checked out biographies. Mrs. Price preferred mystery. And young Noah Jennings always borrowed sketchbooks even though the library never officially stocked them. Evelyn stocked them unofficially. No one questioned why. At 11:30 a.m., she walked to the Pinebrook post office to help sort donation letters for the village charity drive. She read return addresses like life stories, imagining the hands that wrote them. Some envelopes carried shaky script, some bold, some rushed. Handwriting told truths voices did not always reveal. Her empathy lived in her observations, not her declarations. By 1:00 p.m., she arrived at Pinebrook Community Center to prepare soup for the weekly outreach lunch. She chopped carrots with practiced rhythm, stirred broth with patient circles, seasoned without measuring spoons because experience had replaced them. Strength was not loud. Strength was not self-announced. Strength was simply the fact that her hands did not tremble despite the history they carried. At 3:45 p.m., she returned home to write handwritten encouragement notes for the anonymous care packages she distributed every winter. The notes never revealed her name, but they always carried a signature sentiment. Someone sees you, even if you don't see them. She meant it for others. She felt it for herself. Evelyn had competence, strength, structure, usefulness, purpose. But there was one quiet fracture she could never shelve neatly, never prune clean, never stir into broth. She was structurally present, but emotionally unheld. Not unloved, she had been loved fiercely by Thomas. But love, once lost, leaves a person unsure where to place the receiving end of it again. At 5:30 p.m. each evening, she sat by the window as lantern-colored dusk brushed Pinebrook's rooftops. This was the hour grief felt boldest, when motion stopped, feeling returned. Not violent, not overwhelming, just undeniably human. She watched people walking in pairs, bundled in coats, sharing scarves, sharing warmth, sharing sentences that did not require effort to sustain. She missed ease more than she missed youth. Arthur Bennett first noticed her not in a moment of dramatic vulnerability, but in a moment of uncelebrated strength. It was 2 days after the community hall remark. Arthur had risen early that morning, still adjusting to the cadence of Pinebrook Village. His rental home, temporary but clean, smelled faintly of cedar wood. Margaret had loved cedar. Unlike Evelyn's lavender, his grief lived in open air, not drawers. He spoke Margaret's name aloud sometimes, not as a plea, but as acknowledgement that love once spoken should not be forced back into silence simply because the speaker aged. He respected grief that did not demand performance. He shoveled snow at 6:15 a.m., clearing his own walkway before noticing a second figure further down the path, already kneeling at the community flower beds, brushing snow from dormant stems as if greeting old friends. Evelyn. He recognized her silver bun first, then the posture of someone who had endured years without folding inward. There was competence in the movement, but also something quieter, harder to define. A reverence for living things, for uncelebrated labor, for continuity even when continuity hurt. Arthur paused, watched not intrusively, respectfully. She worked like someone, fulfilling a promise made to someone no longer there. He understood that language. At 6:32 a.m., Evelyn stood brushing soil from her gloves. Arthur did not approach. Instead, he noted the exactness of her kindness, done without audience, without ceremony, without claim. At 7:10 a.m., he found her again outside the bakery, purchasing 2 loaves of bread. She kept one, then left the second on a nearby donation shelf labeled "Take what you need." She did not look around to ensure she was seen. She assumed invisibility, and kindness was more efficient when done quietly anyway. Arthur liked that about her too. By 10:45 a.m., he crossed her path again at the library. She was organizing stationery. The motion was deliberate, competent, ritualistic. He overheard Ms. Rowan saying, "You've saved this place more hours than the council has." Evelyn smiled faintly. Libraries should feel saved, not rescued. He stored that sentence in memory, like a lantern stored for winter. Arthur was not impulsive. He did not narrate his admiration yet, but recognition is a seed, and seeds, even dormant ones, quietly prepare for spring long before they bloom. He saw her competence, her dignity, her silent labor, and he sensed, without needing proof yet, that behind the structure lived a person who had spent years giving warmth while unsure whether warmth would ever return to her. That made her story unfinished. Not ended, not expired, unfinished. And unfinished stories, Arthur believed, were not tragedies. They were invitations. Cruelty, when it does not raise its voice, is often mistaken for normal conversation. The comment in the community hall had spread through Pinebrook like ink seeping into unlined paper. Not hurried, not dramatic, simply irreversible once released. By the time Evelyn stepped outside again, her story had already been edited by people who assumed they were helping by narrating it for her. 2 mornings after the remark, she arrived at the library carrying a stack of donated winter coats she intended to organize for the annual outreach drive. The coats were folded neatly, labels pinned by size, categorized before anyone else had even unlocked the storage closet. Preparation, she believed, was a form of respect. The injustice found her before she found the closet door. "Oh, Evelyn, love is lovely, but you must know your place in life." The voice came from behind her, gentle in tone, firm in meaning. Mr. Hawthorne, a retired school principal whose words carried chalk dust weight, stood by the circulation desk, hands clasped behind his back. Evelyn turned, not startled, only braced. He continued, not unkindly, which was precisely the problem. "You've lived your story already. Romance isn't written for your chapter anymore. Better to let the young carry that torch, don't you think?" A torch, he had said. A lantern was what she imagined. She swallowed the correction. "I wasn't carrying any torch, sir, only coats." He waved it off with a warm laugh, the kind meant to close discussion, not open it. "Still serving others, that's your gift now. Some gifts are seasonal, dear woman." Seasonal. The implication was not subtle, only socially permitted. Her heart had been assigned an expiration date by consensus, not evidence. Ms. Rowan looked up from her computer, fingers paused over the keyboard. She admired Evelyn too much to interrupt the conversation, and too practically to challenge a former principal. Silence in Pinebrook had etiquette. Confrontation did not. She said nothing. At 12:10 p.m. that same day, Evelyn stood at the Pinebrook market selecting apples for the weekend bake sale. The produce aisle was narrow, lined with wooden crates that smelled faintly of orchard dust. She moved with deliberate care, choosing apples by weight, not color. Heavier fruit made better filling. A cluster of women stood nearby, admiring winter squash. Their voices were casual, conversational, thoughtless in the way gossip often is when it believes itself harmless. Did you hear? Evelyn's at it again. At what again? Oh, love nonsense, at her age. A scoff, light but certain. The poor woman thinks grief gives her a second chance at romance. Another voice, softer but no kinder. Grief gives casseroles, not courtship. Evelyn continued selecting apples. Her hands did not falter, only her pulse did. The women glanced at her basket, then at her face, then away again, embarrassed not by the cruelty, but by the fact she had heard it. Mrs. Dalloway herself arrived at 12:14 p.m., heels tapping against the linoleum like punctuation marks. She did not lower her voice, because lowering her voice would have implied wrongdoing. "Well, Evelyn," she said brightly, "Arthur seems like a pleasant man, but pleasant men don't rewrite finished stories." Evelyn did not correct her that the story had not been finished by the author, only by the audience. Mrs. Dalloway smiled with pragmatic pity. Some hearts are souvenirs, not seeds. Evelyn's breath remained steady, her dignity intact, her spirit quietly rearranging itself around the insult like furniture around an empty chair. Arthur was not present in the aisle. That did not matter. The town was performing his assumptions for him. By 4:55 p.m., the story found its most visible stage yet. The Pinebrook Historical Society held its monthly open house in the old Lakeside Gallery, a charming building with flacking green shutters and a bell that chimed slightly out of tune when the wind pushed it. Evelyn had volunteered to curate a display of Thomas's landscape paintings, not for sentimentality, but because the town had forgotten the gentle artist who once gave its sunsets a canvas. She remembered for them. A group of patrons admired the paintings, murmuring polite nostalgia until someone spotted the framed sketch at the corner of the display. The drawing Thomas had gifted her on their wedding day, Evelyn by the lake, laughing, young, unfiltered. The comment that followed cracked the gallery warmer than winter ever could. Such a beautiful girl, shame she grew out of her story. Evelyn did not flinch outwardly, only inwardly. Another patron nodded. Some love stories don't survive their own endings, others simply shouldn't continue past them. Murmurs of agreement, the soft hum of shared assumption. The town, always charitable with food and function, starved its elders of narrative possibility. Arthur arrived at 5:03 p.m., unaware that the room had already decided the emotional ending he had not written. Evelyn saw him before anyone else did. A wool coat dusted with snowflakes, a posture familiar, quiet, observant. He admired the paintings first, her paintings, really, then the display structure, then her. He did not speak yet. The town did. "Oh, Arthur, you've been such a comfort to Evelyn," someone said kindly. "Comfort is what she needs now," another agreed. "Yes, no romance chaos at this age," Mrs. Dalloway added with a polite nod. Chaos? Chaos was what they feared, not what she had asked for. Arthur looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the lantern-colored reflection in the gallery window. No one defended her heart, because no one believed it was under attack. But injustice does not require raised fists to be injustice. Sometimes injustice is simply the gentle, unchallenged belief that certain people no longer deserve new beginnings. And Pinebrook believed that about her. Not loudly, only collectively, which made it harder to contradict and harder to heal from. Evelyn thanked the patrons for attending, smiled when they praised Thomas, repacked the coats she had organized, then walked home alone at 6:11 p.m., carrying not humiliation. She refused to carry humiliation but a quiet resolve not yet shaped into words. Arthur remained behind for a moment. He did not know yet how he would intervene. Only that silence, when it is consensus, is sometimes louder than cruelty itself. And that tonight, the town had proven something important. They had never doubted Evelyn's kindness, only her right to receive it back. The next morning the town seemed unchanged, as if yesterday had been no more than a dream of cruelty. Snow had fallen overnight, a delicate, soft blanket muffling every footstep, every sharp word, every lingering glance. Evelyn stepped onto the library path, boots crunching quietly, carrying her usual bag of returned books. She did not speak of yesterday. She did not need to. The town's assumptions had already spoken loud enough for her. Arthur Bennett had anticipated her arrival, though he had not known it until he saw her through the library window. He did not hurry. He did not position himself for dramatic rescue. Instead, he took a slower route, the kind of deliberate, unnoticed approach that gave someone the choice to notice you or not. He found her kneeling by the icy stone walkway outside, attempting to clear snow before morning visitors arrived. Her gloves were damp, the wind tugging at her scarf, but she moved with the same quiet authority she always carried. He could see the meticulousness of her labor, not perfection, but care. Not heroism, but thoughtfulness. He knelt beside her without announcing himself. Not to confront, not to advise, simply to be present. "You've caught the frost early this morning," he said softly. Evelyn did not flinch, though she raised her head. Her eyes, silver and deep, met his. "It's easier than waiting for someone to notice it needs doing," she replied evenly. Her voice was calm, but in it lingered the weight of 1,000 tasks performed without applause. Arthur's response was the smallest kind of kindness, practical, human, unobtrusive. He lifted the snow-covered books she had brought outside earlier, setting them gently on the bench. "I thought you might need these. Don't want to add unnecessary weight," he said. She blinked, not at his generosity but at its ordinary gentleness. No spotlight, no lecture, no declaration of sympathy. "Thank you," she whispered, finally allowing a breath she had been holding since yesterday's murmurs and stares. Arthur did not linger in praise. He did not extend pity. He merely began clearing the remaining ice along the walkway, matching her rhythm. Their movements fell into a quiet cadence, not conversation, but companionship. For an hour they worked together. Evelyn observed the rhythm of his hands, noting their steadiness, the way he maintained balance without sacrificing care. She noted the absence of judgment in his presence. When the snow had been cleared to a safe path, Arthur straightened and offered a hand, not for ceremony, but to help her up. She took it with a faint smile, her fingers brushing against his with the ease of familiarity. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the world doesn't notice what's right in front of it, but it doesn't make the work any less important." Evelyn considered that. Her life had been largely unnoticed, quietly executed, largely assumed to be complete in ways others dictated. And yet here was a man acknowledging the work itself, not her, not her age, not her loneliness, simply the act of tending to what mattered. They did not speak again immediately. They walked side by side toward the library entrance. Arthur held the door, a gesture so small it could have been overlooked. Evelyn caught it anyway. Inside, she helped reorganize the returned books. He shelved alongside her, not intruding, not demanding, only present. His presence was the sort that healed by mere proximity, quiet, patient, unobtrusive. It did not erase the world's unkindness, but it gave her room to continue existing without defending herself. Later that afternoon, Evelyn found herself sitting on the park bench near the frozen pond, feeding the few birds brave enough to venture out in the snow. Arthur approached, a paper bag in hand. "Would you mind if I joined you?" he asked. His voice was calm and it carried no expectation. She hesitated briefly. She could say no. She had always said no, often, but something about the gentleness in his tone suggested he would not take offense. She nodded. He sat, leaving a respectful distance between them, and began scattering seeds alongside her. Silence stretched, comfortable, unmeasured. Neither attempted to fill it with words that might overstep or overpromise. "You see them, don't you?" she said finally, referring not to the birds but to the moment. Arthur looked at her, curious. Small acts, she continued, they go unnoticed by most, yet they matter. They always matter, even when no one acknowledges them. Arthur nodded. He understood more than he could say. Some lights are meant to shine quietly, he replied. She smiled faintly, the edges of her lips turning upward without performing joy. A small acknowledgement of understanding. A connection made not through dramatic confession, but through recognition of shared values. Days passed like this. Arthur's kindness never escalated into fanfare. No grand gestures, no declarations, no pronouncements of love. Only small, consistent actions, offering to carry heavy books, adjusting her scarf when a draft blew in, leaving notes in her mailbox with no expectation of reply. Evelyn noticed these gestures, but she did not immediately interpret them as signals. They were not signals, they were care, plain and simple. The beauty of his approach was its respect. She never felt pressured, never obliged to reciprocate in ways she could not manage. His kindness was a mirror reflecting the possibility of being seen without being objectified, appreciated without being patronized. And slowly, over weeks, a subtle change emerged. Evelyn began to expect warmth not because it was promised, but because it was delivered consistently. She allowed herself small moments of anticipation, a knowing that a bench by the pond would no longer be empty, that someone might notice her effort before the world moved past it. It was quiet, deliberate healing. Evelyn began to speak more freely about Thomas, his paintings, his sketches, the framed drawing by the lake that had survived decades. She had never shared these details beyond close family, and yet with Arthur they unfolded naturally. He listened, not with judgment, not with pity, not with interruption, simply with attention which, for someone unseen most of her life, felt like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. One evening, after the library had closed and the snow outside had hardened into a silver crust, Evelyn found a small envelope tucked under her door. No flower smudges, no obvious handwriting, nothing that suggested grand sentimentality. Just paper. She opened it carefully. Inside was a note, written in clear, deliberate handwriting. You do not owe the world an explanation for your kindness, nor do you owe it permission to believe in you. Keep going, Evelyn. Some lights are meant to shine quietly, but they deserve to be shared when possible. She read it twice. Then quietly she folded it and placed it on her bedside table. It was not love, not yet, not a confession of devotion. It was something rarer, acknowledgement, validation, and the subtle offering of permission to hope again without apology. Evelyn thought about the winter morning when she had cleared the library steps, the moment when his hands had reached hers as if to anchor her to the present without taking over her story. She realized she had never been asked to believe she could exist in this space, unjudged, unpunished, seen for simply being herself. Arthur's intervention had not erased the town's assumptions. It had not stopped their whispers or their polite dismissals, but it had quietly rewritten the terms for her. She could continue giving, continue existing, and perhaps, eventually, continue receiving. And for someone who had spent decades expecting only solitude, this was revolutionary. She did not need to rush toward recognition, toward gratitude, toward emotional reckoning. She only needed to acknowledge that kindness, when it respected boundaries and observed without demand, could heal in ways no other action could. That evening, she set out her basket of cookies for the community center volunteers, knowing Arthur would not seek credit, nor would she. She paused for a moment outside her home, looking at the snow-brushed streetlights and the silhouettes of houses across the lane. She thought, perhaps the world can still surprise me. It was enough for now. The first time Evelyn and Arthur truly spoke about loss, it was not under lanterns or in public, nor during a conspicuous act of kindness. It happened in the soft half-light of late afternoon, when the library was empty, and the town seemed to fold in on itself under the weight of winter's gray sky. Evelyn had been arranging a display of children's books, stacking the hardcover editions carefully according to size, the spines aligned like disciplined soldiers. She paused, noticing that one shelf leaned slightly, threatening to topple under its own quiet order. As she reached to adjust it, Arthur walked silently into the room, carrying a small stack of poetry books he had found in the returns bin. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood, observing her movement, hands relaxed at his sides. Evelyn straightened, brushing her hands on her cardigan, though she did not need to apologize for the tilt of a shelf. Everything in her life had been tilted at some point. She had learned and survived it without complaint. Arthur stepped forward, setting the books on a nearby table. "You notice everything," he said softly, a quiet statement rather than a question. "I try," she replied, though she could have left it at that. But something in his voice invited honesty, a rare invitation in a world that had long dismissed her attention to detail as quaint or unnecessary. He nodded, understanding without pressing. "I used to notice too before everything changed," he said. His words floated in the space between them like dust motes in sunlight, suspended, fragile, almost imperceptible. She did not ask what had changed. She already sensed it. She had known grief for long enough to recognize its different forms, the outward expression that demands acknowledgement and the inward endurance that demands concealment. "I lost Margaret 3 years ago," Arthur continued, "but some days it feels like it never really ended. She was my companion in every thought, every moment that mattered. And then one day she was." His voice faltered for a fraction of a second, the only crack in the otherwise steady tone he maintained. Evelyn's chest constricted, not in pity but in recognition. She knew that feeling well. 8 years ago, Thomas had passed quietly in his sleep, leaving her with a heart so hollow she could hear echoes where memories once lived. Not echoes of loss, but echoes of continuation that she had been denied. "I understand," she said simply, the understatement heavy with years of private mourning. Arthur looked at her surprised. Most people did not understand. Most people offered empty condolences or worse, assumed a woman her age had no right to future attachment or desire. "You do?" he asked, soft enough to be cautious. "I do," she whispered. "I loved him fiercely. He was my life in the way that small, ordinary lives can be life itself. And now he is gone, but I am still here." Arthur's expression softened. "I thought I was the only one who could say that." They did not speak again immediately. The silence was not awkward. It was the kind of quiet that forms when two people are carrying the same weight but have not yet named it aloud. Days turned into weeks. Their meetings, once incidental, began to acquire a natural rhythm. At the park, they watched winter birds forage in the snow. At the library, they sorted books side by side. On cold mornings, Arthur would find Evelyn already clearing ice from the walkways and quietly join her, never announcing his presence, never claiming gratitude. In the presence of each other, their grief became a shared companion rather than an isolating force. And yet, they did not rush to fill the silence with words of solace, nor with declarations of intimacy. They allowed the wounds to exist side by side, observed but not exposed, recognized but not exploited. One afternoon, Arthur took a small step, the first gesture that went beyond practical kindness. He retrieved a sketchbook from the library's donated pile, a collection of charcoal drawings from a local artist he did not know. He approached Evelyn cautiously. "I thought you might appreciate these," he said, placing it in her hands. Evelyn turned the pages slowly. Each sketch was imperfect, raw, intimate. Some depicted landscapes, others solitary figures, and one captured a woman standing beneath a tree, shoulders squared, gaze steady, a reflection of her own resilience. She looked up at Arthur, searching his eyes for judgment or expectation, but found none. Only acknowledgement. Only the recognition that someone else could see her not for what she had lost, but for what she had endured. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it. Not for the sketches alone, but for the thoughtfulness that had guided him to offer them. Arthur did not respond with words. He smiled faintly, the edges of his eyes crinkling in a way that suggested he understood the depth of the gesture. There was no hurry, no declaration, only the subtle act of witnessing. In time, Evelyn began to speak more openly about Thomas. She shared stories of their quiet life, the afternoons spent by the lake while he painted her reflection in the water, the evenings when they would listen to music and talk about dreams too small for recognition, the simple magic of being chosen every day by someone who saw the ordinary as extraordinary. Arthur, in turn, revealed moments of his life with Margaret, how she would read poetry aloud while stirring soup, the careful way she had organized their bookshelves, the tiny habits that were ordinary only to them, but sacred in their shared life. There was no rivalry between griefs, no attempt to compare suffering, only a delicate balance of giving voice to loss while simultaneously discovering that the present could still offer moments of connection. One rainy afternoon, Evelyn arrived at the library to find a small, hand-carved wooden bird sitting on the return desk. Attached to it was a note in Arthur's careful handwriting. Somewhere between the past and the present, small reminders of beauty can find us again. Perhaps this one is for you. Evelyn held the bird in her hands, turning it gently, noticing the attention to detail in its wings, its tiny feet, its smooth body. She did not say anything aloud. She placed it on the edge of the windowsill, where it could catch sunlight and watch over the library as she worked. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a public display, but its quietness carried a weight greater than words. It said, "You are seen, you are valued, and this recognition does not diminish the memory of the one you loved." Through months of these small exchanges, a bond formed. It was subtle, built on mutual understanding rather than expectation, a network of shared vulnerabilities that neither party forced nor exaggerated. They began to anticipate each other's rhythms. When Evelyn would arrive at the park bench, when Arthur would be clearing ice, when the library would need an extra hand for shelving returns. They discovered that shared grief could transform into shared resilience. Pain, when mirrored, became not a burden but a testament to survival. They laughed quietly at private jokes born from observation, never for performance, never for approval. And then, one morning, Evelyn shared something she had never spoken aloud. She showed Arthur the framed sketch Thomas had given her on their wedding day, her laughter captured at the lakeside, the brushstrokes uneven but full of life. She explained how she had hung it above her bed, how she had looked at it each morning for years, allowing herself to remember joy without being consumed by longing. Arthur listened, not with pity, not with critique, only with attention, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady. "I never thought I would show this to anyone," she said softly. "You should have," he replied gently. "It's beautiful and it belongs in the world as much as it belongs to you." Evelyn considered the words, realizing that this was the first time someone had acknowledged her inner life without judgment, without assuming that her grief should limit her future. She felt a strange, unfamiliar relief, not the relief of closure, but the relief of being understood. Arthur, in turn, began to acknowledge his own lingering attachments. He told her about the letters Margaret had left him unsent, unfinished, and how they reminded him that love is rarely tidy. He spoke of quiet regrets, small moments where he had faltered, and of the days when memory felt like both a gift and a weight. Evelyn did not rush to comfort him. She did not offer platitudes. She listened, offering small gestures of empathy, a nod, a silent acknowledgement, a shared glance that conveyed understanding without intrusion. In these exchanges, they found a rhythm that was entirely their own. They no longer needed the validation of the town or the approval of others. Their shared vulnerability created a space where they could exist fully, neither overshadowed by the past nor burdened by expectation. And in this space, a subtle truth emerged. Love, or whatever shape it might take in later life, need not be declared to be real. It could exist quietly between gestures in shared understanding, in recognition of endurance, in acknowledgement of continued presence despite the weight of loss. Arthur never asked for reciprocation. Evelyn never offered promises. They discovered, gradually, that healing could coexist with grief. That companionship could exist without performance. That two people, carrying different but parallel wounds, could walk side by side without diminishing each other's past. By the time the first snow melted, they had formed a quiet, unspoken bond. It was not a story anyone in Pinebrook could easily narrate. There were no headlines, no dramatic declarations, no signs that the world could cling to. There was only the slow, deliberate act of noticing. Noticing pain, noticing endurance, noticing quiet dignity and the subtle possibility of hope. Evelyn realized that she had at last met someone who could see her wholly. The competence, the strength, the grief, the unspoken yearning for acknowledgement. She had not been rescued nor needed rescue. She had been witnessed. And that more than any grand gesture was transformative. Arthur, in turn, recognized that he had not found someone to fill the space left by Margaret. He had found someone whose life, whose care, whose endurance complemented his own. Not to replace, not to overwrite, but to coexist. Together, they moved through winter as two souls who understood the weight of what had been lost and the possibility of what could still exist. They did not speak of love, not yet. They spoke of small acts, mutual recognition, and the dignity of continuing to participate in life when much of the world had assumed it was over for them. And in this shared understanding, both found a measure of peace they had thought impossible to regain. Winter had begun its slow retreat, leaving behind streets of Pinebrook still damp from melting snow and sidewalks that glistened under early morning frost. Evelyn Carter's days were no longer punctuated solely by structured acts of service. Instead, they had begun to weave around a new thread of quiet connection, threaded subtly by Arthur Bennett's presence. Yet the rhythm of her life remained anchored in responsibility. The bakery still needed her early mornings. The library still relied on her exacting eye. The community flower bed still required care even as frost receded. Even as she began to anticipate Arthur's arrival for the park bench walks, she remained resolutely committed to the things she had always done. Evelyn had learned long ago that life demanded attention to ordinary tasks. Grief had taught her that continuity was as much a form of resistance as remembrance. And now, as she rose at dawn to tend the flower beds, she carried an unspoken acknowledgement that life's burdens were not lighter simply because companionship existed. Rather, they were shared, sometimes silently, sometimes by proximity rather than declaration. On a Thursday morning, as Evelyn carried baskets of freshly baked bread from the bakery to the donation shelf, she was reminded that kindness could collide with resistance. A neighbor, Mrs. Fenwick, caught sight of her, frowning. "Evelyn, why do you still go to such lengths?" she asked. "Don't you tire yourself? Aren't these things enough already?" Evelyn paused, placing a loaf of bread on the shelf. "It's enough for me if it matters to someone else," she replied quietly. Her words were not defensive, they were matter of fact. Mrs. Fenwick shook her head. "I just worry. People say you've given enough." Evelyn smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. Perhaps the world is mistaken about what enough means. These moments, small and unspectacular, revealed the continued resistance of the town to her autonomy. They expected her labor but not her vitality. They admired the visible results of her kindness, but rarely considered her needs or desires beyond that framework. Arthur noticed these dynamics. Over time, he began to act in ways that were subtle yet sustaining. When he accompanied her to the market, he quietly carried the heavier bags, allowing her to move with dignity without having to acknowledge fatigue. When she lingered on a park bench, choosing to feed the birds slowly, he never pressed her to leave, recognizing that her pace mattered as much as the act itself. but life remained complicated. The extended context of family and social obligations introduced pressures that neither she nor Arthur could entirely control. Evelyn's niece, Marion, visited frequently, offering well-meaning advice that sometimes felt intrusive. "A woman your age shouldn't exert herself so," Marion said once over tea, eyes soft but concerned. "You deserve rest, Evelyn. You've done enough." Evelyn listened, nodding, allowing Marion to voice her concern without taking offense. She had learned that familial care, even when clumsy, was not inherently cruel. It was a reflection of limited understanding rather than malice. She thanked Marion politely, recognizing that gratitude for intent did not require agreement with execution. Arthur, too, navigated pressures from his own circle. Friends in his previous town had questioned his relocation to Pinebrook, assuming he was escaping the past rather than seeking a future. Some teased him gently, not knowing that in quiet companionship with Evelyn, he had found a depth of human connection he had never experienced elsewhere. Despite these social pressures, Evelyn and Arthur discovered that their relationship with each other could remain resilient precisely because it existed outside public expectation. They had no need for dramatic declarations, no requirement for ceremonies or recognition. Their bond was defined not by performative milestones, but by the quiet constancy of shared presence. One afternoon, Evelyn faced a setback that reminded her of the fragility of life even in its routines. While clearing the ice from the library walk, she slipped, twisting her ankle sharply. She did not cry out, not immediately. Pain, she had learned, required acknowledgement but not performance. Arthur arrived moments later, as if summoned by instinct, helping her to a bench. "You'll be all right," he asked, his voice calm, careful, not pitying, not commanding. "I will," she said, her tone steady, though her hands trembled slightly from the strain of balance and pain. He sat beside her, silent for a long moment. He did not attempt to carry her forward. He did not offer a dramatic solution. Instead, he provided quiet presence, an anchor for her to steady herself. She felt the subtle relief of shared endurance, the unspoken assurance that vulnerability did not diminish dignity. Days of minor setbacks followed. A brief illness that confined her to her bed, a window pane that required repair before the spring thaw, the ongoing negotiations of small family obligations. Each time, Arthur's support was consistent and unobtrusive. He brought meals without comment, carried parcels without expectation, and left notes that reminded her she was seen and valued. Through these practical interactions, Evelyn began to notice a transformation in herself. Not an immediate, dramatic change, but a gradual loosening of the tension that had long constrained her heart. Where she had once expected isolation as a default, she now anticipated companionship, small, steady, unassuming companionship that required no heroic gestures to sustain meaning. Their conversations deepened as well. They spoke of the limitations imposed by age, the disappointments of the world, and the subtle lessons learned from decades of endurance. They discovered that wisdom was not merely knowing what to do but recognizing when to withhold judgment, when to allow others to maintain autonomy, and when to extend support without intrusion. Arthur shared stories from his life with Margaret that revealed not only love, but also the quiet compromises and disappointments of long-term partnership. Evelyn, in turn, spoke of Thomas, not merely as a man she had loved, but as a partner whose presence had shaped her understanding of patience, loyalty, and the quiet art of noticing. There were moments of tension, too. Evelyn occasionally questioned whether she was allowing herself to hope too much, whether the gentle attentions of Arthur were enough to sustain meaningful connection, or whether her own grief had created invisible walls she could not yet dismantle. Arthur, likewise, reflected on the limits of his capacity to support her without overstepping, aware that the fragile balance between presence and autonomy could be disrupted by the slightest misstep. Yet they navigated these tensions with the same care that marked every other aspect of their interactions, through observation, patience, and deliberate restraint. They learned that emotional support was not a matter of solving problems, but of witnessing them, and that shared space could be more powerful than words. Even the town began to notice subtle changes. Evelyn's movements no longer carried the quiet hesitance of isolation. Arthur's presence lent her a visible, though understated, confidence. Yet the public eye remained cautious. Pinebrook villagers, habituated to the narrative that she had already lived her story, often misread her composure as evidence of continued solitude. One particularly ordinary day, as the sun slanted across the library windows and dust motes floated lazily in the light, Arthur presented Evelyn with a small, practical gift, a sturdy, hand-woven scarf. "I thought you might need it," he said simply. "Not as a gesture, not as a statement, just for warmth." Evelyn examined it, fingers brushing over the careful stitches. It was not luxurious. It did not attempt to impress. Yet its significance was profound. It acknowledged her needs without presuming her desires. It recognized her vulnerability without diminishing her dignity. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will use it." Arthur nodded, understanding that acknowledgement of kindness could be enough, without embellishment. They continued their work at the library, arranging books and chatting quietly, the scarf draped over her shoulders like a subtle shield against the chill outside and the residual coldness of the world. Evenings brought continued reflection. Evelyn found herself thinking less about the judgment of others and more about the deliberate choices she had made, to continue giving, to continue noticing, to continue existing in ways that mattered to her. Arthur's presence illuminated possibilities she had long thought closed. That connection could exist without demand, that companionship could be sustained through gestures rather than declarations, and that shared understanding could offer a pathway toward renewed hope without erasing the past. Their bond, built on repeated small acts, was resilient precisely because it was unassuming. They discovered that life in later years was not diminished by age, nor constrained by previous grief. Rather, it could offer subtle opportunities for growth, recognition, and mutual support, if approached with patience, attentiveness, and humility. By the time the first buds of spring appeared along the library walkways, Evelyn felt a quiet transformation taking root. She moved with the same diligence, the same attention to detail, but her heart carried a new elasticity, a subtle openness to the possibility that life could continue to surprise her. Arthur, likewise, experienced a gentle awakening. He realized that love and companionship were not finite, nor bound by age. They were living practices, cultivated through recognition, respect, and presence. In his quiet support of Evelyn, he found a mirrored solace for his own grief, discovering that the shared experience of endurance could be profoundly sustaining. Together, they navigated the ordinary pressures of life, family expectations, social judgments, daily responsibilities, with a shared understanding that neither performance nor recognition was required. They learned to define success in their companionship not by external validation, but by the persistence of care, attention, and acknowledgement in daily life. And in the subtle repetition of these small acts, they discovered a profound truth. Life's richness is not measured by grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but by the steady, patient cultivation of understanding, empathy, and unassuming companionship. The town continued its routines, largely unaware of the depth of their connection, and that perhaps was exactly as it should be. For Evelyn and Arthur, the significance lay not in public acclaim, but in the quiet reality of being seen, being valued, and being understood in the ordinary, sustaining rhythms of daily life. What part of this story feels most real to you so far? Spring arrived in Pinebrook not with a sudden rush of color, but with the slow unfolding of warmth. Buds pushed against soft soil, and the scent of damp earth clung faintly to the air. The days lengthened subtly, carrying light into the quiet corners of the village. For Evelyn, the change was both external and internal, a gentle reminder that time moved, even when one carried the weight of decades. She had maintained her routines, still tending to flower beds, baking pies, organizing library books, and leaving small notes in care packages. Yet beneath these ordinary acts, something had shifted. There was an anticipatory quality in her movements, a subtle awareness that her world was not entirely solitary, even if the town believed otherwise. Arthur's presence was now as regular as the sunrise. He never intruded, never forced acknowledgement, never transformed small moments into grand events. He simply existed in parallel with her life, observing, assisting quietly, offering gestures that never demanded gratitude but always respected dignity. One afternoon, as she returned from the bakery with a basket of freshly baked bread, she noticed a small pile of stones neatly arranged at the edge of the library's front steps. They were smooth, rounded by years of weathering, and each stone had been placed with deliberate care. Arthur stepped into view carrying a watering can. He did not smile dramatically, nor did he call attention to the stones. He simply tilted his head toward them, letting Evelyn notice. "They seemed like they belonged here," he said softly. "A kind of marker, a reminder." Evelyn approached the stones, crouching to examine them. Each was unique, some darker, some lighter, some slightly cracked. She understood immediately. He had gathered them during his walks, observing their ordinary beauty and selecting those that spoke quietly of resilience. "They're simple," she remarked, "nothing elaborate." Arthur shook his head. "Simple is enough. They don't need to be elaborate to mean something." Evelyn studied the arrangement. There was a subtle symmetry, a hidden order that spoke of intention. She realized the gesture carried layers of significance, the recognition of small beauty, the preservation of dignity, and the understanding that meaning could exist without spectacle. "It's like a quiet celebration," she said finally, the words hesitant, as if admitting them aloud might disturb the serenity of the moment. Arthur nodded. "A celebration of the ordinary, of endurance, of being seen without expectation. That's all it needs to be." Evelyn felt a stirring inside her, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a gentle acknowledgement of being recognized. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the possibility of joy without apology. The stones were a metaphor she did not need to unpack entirely. Their presence alone sufficed. Over the following weeks, the arrangement became a small ritual. Evelyn would pause by the stones on her way to the library or the park, running her fingers along their smooth surfaces, noticing subtle differences in texture, shape, and warmth. Each stone reminded her of the quiet consistency of Arthur's support, the careful attention he gave without presumption or intrusion. One morning, after a brief spring rain, Evelyn found a single flower tucked gently between the stones. Its petals were soft, delicate, a faint shade of lavender. She recognized the significance immediately. Thomas's favorite scent, quiet and unassuming, woven into the symbolic gesture Arthur had begun. She did not look for a note. She did not need one. The act itself carried the message. She was seen, her past remembered, and her present acknowledged. Arthur appeared shortly after, as if summoned by her quiet attention. "It seemed right," he said simply, brushing his coat sleeve. "Nothing more, nothing less." Evelyn looked at him, at the stones, at the flower, and felt a sense of calm she had not experienced in decades. This was not romance, at least not in the dramatic sense. It was something subtler: recognition, continuity, respect for her entire life, both past and present. She realized that the greatest acts of kindness did not need to be spectacular. They did not require public acknowledgement, ceremony, or applause. They needed only to be intentional, consistent, and sensitive to the dignity of the recipient. That evening, Evelyn placed a small note by the stones herself. "Thank you for seeing me." She left it without expectation. It was enough to acknowledge the connection, without transforming it into something performative. The next day, Arthur added a tiny pebble beside the flower, a silent response to her note. He did not comment on it. Evelyn did not seek explanation. The exchange was deliberate in its simplicity, conveying meaning without words, without fuss, without the pressures of conventional emotional expression. Through this small, ongoing interaction, Evelyn and Arthur discovered a new dimension of companionship. They did not require declarations of love or public acknowledgement. Their gestures, subtle and symbolic, provided a language through which they could share recognition, respect, and emotional support. Even the town, largely unaware of these quiet rituals, began to notice a change in Evelyn. She walked with a subtle lightness, no longer entirely bound by the weight of isolation or social expectation. Her small acts of service continued, but they were now accompanied by an openness to connection, a willingness to receive quietly, without drama or announcement. Arthur, for his part, continued his unobtrusive support. He never overstepped, never attempted to define the bond, never demanded reciprocity. He simply provided continuity, creating space for Evelyn to exist fully in her own rhythm, with her own dignity intact. One afternoon, as the sunlight slanted through the library windows, Evelyn paused by the stones again. Arthur joined her silently, offering no commentary, no gesture beyond his presence. She noticed, perhaps for the first time, that this silence, the deliberate absence of expectation, was itself an act of profound kindness. They stood side by side, observing the stones, the flower, the subtle play of light and shadow. Neither spoke for several minutes. The absence of words carried weight equal to any declaration. It conveyed understanding, empathy, and the quiet acknowledgement of mutual endurance. Evelyn realized that the symbolic gesture, the stones, the flower, the small, consistent acts, had created a bridge between past grief and present possibility. It was not an erasure of memory, nor a promise of future certainty. It was a recognition that life, even in its ordinary moments, could carry meaning, dignity, and connection. The act did not require an audience. It did not demand validation. It existed entirely for the sake of presence, acknowledgement, and subtle continuity. And in that quiet space, Evelyn allowed herself to believe, for the first time in years, that she could be both remembered and seen, both enduring and noticed, both independent and accompanied. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Evelyn and Arthur walked back toward the library together, the stones behind them catching the fading light. Neither spoke of the gesture, nor did they need to. The meaning had already been conveyed fully, in silence and simple attention. For Evelyn, it was a revelation that small acts, sustained over time, could carry as much emotional significance as any grand event or public demonstration. That recognition need not be loud to be transformative. That connection, when built on respect and observation, could be deeply sustaining, even in the absence of dramatic gestures or verbal affirmation. And for Arthur, it was equally profound. That kindness could exist without expectation, that care could be offered without demand, and that two people, carrying parallel experiences of loss, could create a shared world of subtle understanding and quiet dignity. The stones, the flower, the pebble, and the shared attention became their ongoing ritual, a tangible, symbolic representation of what had begun to take root in both of their hearts: trust, respect, recognition, and the possibility of connection unburdened by spectacle. It was not a conclusion. It was not a declaration. It was a quiet, living proof that acts of care, consistent, thoughtful, subtle, could shape human hearts in ways that neither time nor grief could entirely diminish. And in that quietness, Evelyn and Arthur found a profound satisfaction. Not the fleeting thrill of romance, not the validation of others, not the erasure of the past, but the enduring, subtle acknowledgement of each other's presence, the shared recognition of resilience, and the transformative power of kindness that asks for nothing in return. The spring that followed, the symbolic gestures of stones and flowers, brought with it a new rhythm in Pinebrook Village, though the world remained unchanged in its routines. Evelyn Carter continued her days with familiar tasks: baking, tending the library, caring for the flower beds. Yet beneath this ordinary structure, her heart had begun to carry a subtle lightness, a quiet elasticity born of shared attention and consistent, unintrusive kindness. But growth is rarely linear. Evelyn found herself confronting consequences she had not anticipated, not from others' cruelty, but from the internal transformations she had begun to allow. One afternoon, as she swept the library steps free of spring debris, a young volunteer lingered nearby. "I thought I saw you with Mr. Bennett yesterday," the teenager said casually, almost too casually, as if testing boundaries. Are you too?" The words hung in the air, trailing with the judgment of unspoken assumptions. Evelyn paused mid-sweep, considering how to respond. She could have corrected them, explained, or reassured them, but instead she chose quiet dignity. "Arthur is a friend," she said simply. The words carried no defensiveness, only fact. The teen nodded, but the lingering curiosity in their eyes reminded Evelyn that progress in the heart does not always align with progress in perception. She continued her sweeping, nodding, the subtle relief of asserting her truth without allowing it to become a performance. Later that evening, Evelyn faced a more personal consequence of emotional growth. She recognized a longing she had long denied. She felt a small, unfamiliar ache of anticipation when thinking of Arthur's presence, a gentle desire for companionship that did not demand or expect anything in return. It was neither reckless nor romanticized, merely an acknowledgement of the heart's capacity to continue seeking connection, even in later life. This self-awareness brought both exhilaration and apprehension. She reflected on the years of solitude and the deeply ingrained belief that her life's emotional story had concluded with Thomas. Could she permit herself to hope again? And if so, how could she maintain dignity without sacrificing the lessons of her past grief? Arthur, too, navigated his own set of consequences. The subtle bond they shared had not gone unnoticed entirely. While most of the town remained absorbed in its assumptions about age and love, a few neighbors whispered, questioned, or speculated. Arthur found himself more conscious of how his actions might be interpreted, not because he sought approval, but because he had come to value Evelyn's autonomy and did not wish to complicate it with others' misjudgments. One afternoon, while arranging books at the library, Arthur noticed Evelyn paused over a ledger from decades past, a record of community donations she had maintained meticulously. "You've been keeping these records for years," he observed gently. "Do you ever wonder if anyone notices?" She looked at him, expression calm but reflective. "Not everyone notices," she admitted, "but the work itself matters more than observation. Dignity is often private." Arthur considered her words carefully, understanding that their shared moments of attention were a privilege not contingent on public approval. He recognized that internal validation, rather than external recognition, was the true marker of resilience. The days that followed presented further tests of their emerging emotional growth. Evelyn's niece, Marion, arrived unannounced, offering advice that inadvertently challenged her autonomy. "I just worry that you're pushing yourself too far," Marion said, concern heavy in her tone. "You've already given so much, shouldn't you consider rest?" Evelyn allowed herself a brief pause, feeling the tension between familial concern and personal agency. "Rest is important," she said quietly, "but so is living fully within one's capacity. Doing what matters cannot always be measured by comfort alone." Marion listened, though not entirely convinced, and left with a polite nod. Evelyn felt no frustration, only a subtle reinforcement of her own ability to assert boundaries gently yet firmly. Arthur observed these interactions silently. He had come to appreciate that true support required patience and respect for autonomy, even when those being supported navigated conflicting pressures from family or society. His own growth had mirrored Evelyn's, learning restraint, empathy, and the power of consistent presence without interference. One evening, after a day of library work and tending the flower beds, Evelyn and Arthur walked together along the lakeside path. The air was soft with spring warmth, the water reflecting slivers of sunlight through the bare branches still bearing the faint memory of winter. "You've changed, you know," Arthur said softly, careful not to overstate, careful not to assume. "Not in ways that are obvious, but in the way you carry yourself. There's lightness now, where before there was only endurance." Evelyn smiled faintly, a mixture of amusement and acknowledgement. "Lightness is a luxury earned slowly," she replied. "It is not given freely, not to someone who has been overlooked for decades." Arthur nodded, understanding the subtle truth of her words. The transformation they were experiencing was not instant or dramatic. It was cumulative, the result of countless small moments of attention, recognition, and mutual respect. Their conversations deepened as well. They spoke of boundaries, how to maintain dignity while accepting care, how to allow vulnerability without losing agency, how to embrace the possibility of companionship without erasing individual identity. Each discussion reinforced the quiet growth they were cultivating together. On a particularly warm afternoon, Evelyn returned home from the library to find a basket on her porch. Inside were small items, a hand-sewn handkerchief, a thermos for hot tea, a small book of poems she had mentioned in passing weeks earlier. Attached was a note, written in Arthur's careful hand. "No expectation, no need to respond. Just something to accompany you quietly as you move through your days." Evelyn held the note longer than the items themselves, feeling the subtle acknowledgement it carried. This was not a grand gesture of romance or heroism. It was the quiet affirmation of presence, respect, and continued attention to her needs. She placed the items carefully on her table, reflecting on how transformative such consistency could be. It was not dramatic, yet it had the power to shift her perspective, reminding her that she was not invisible, that her life mattered, and that kindness could exist without demand. Over the weeks, both Evelyn and Arthur began to observe internal growth in each other. Evelyn noticed that she no longer flinched at subtle judgments from the town or family members. She had developed resilience rooted in the acknowledgement of her own dignity. Arthur recognized that he could offer support without overstepping, and that his presence alone could provide comfort, even when words were unnecessary. Their growth was not free from doubt. Some days, lingering grief would resurface, reminding them of past losses. Some days, the town's whispers or assumptions would echo faintly, testing their patience and composure. But each time, they returned to the steady rhythm of mutual recognition, small gestures, and the quiet assurance of respect. Evelyn reflected on how much of her life had been spent unnoticed, performing kindness without acknowledgement, enduring grief without expectation of solace. She recognized that growth was not simply about receiving. It was about learning to navigate the complexities of life while maintaining integrity, autonomy, and a capacity for quiet hope. Arthur, too, considered the consequences of emotional growth. He realized that his grief for Margaret had evolved, not erased, and that in supporting Evelyn, he had discovered a pathway to healing, not by replacing the past, but by honoring it while embracing the possibility of continued connection. Together, they faced setbacks, doubts, and fears, minor injuries, miscommunications, family pressures, and the persistent social assumptions of Pinebrook. Yet in each challenge, they found that kindness, patience, and attentiveness could sustain them, providing a framework for growth that was realistic, gradual, and deeply human. Evelyn began to recognize a subtle shift in how she viewed herself. She no longer defined her worth solely by what she gave or how the town perceived her. She understood that dignity could coexist with vulnerability, that resilience could coexist with tenderness, and that hope could exist without guarantees. Arthur, similarly, realized that true connection did not require dramatic declarations or public acknowledgement. Presence, respect, and consistent attentiveness were sufficient to create trust, understanding, and a quiet sense of belonging. One evening, as they sat together on the park bench, watching the sun set over the lake, Evelyn spoke aloud a thought she had long held privately. "I used to believe that my story ended with loss," she said softly. "That after grief, the world had nothing left to offer me but solitude and routine." Arthur nodded understanding. "And now?" "Now," she replied, "I see that life continues in ways I cannot always control. But in those small, quiet moments, your presence, the attention you give without expectation, the respect you show, I realize there is still room for connection, for dignity, for hope." Arthur remained silent for a moment, allowing her words to settle. Then he said simply, "I feel the same, not because we erase the past, but because we allow the present to exist fully." They sat together, watching the water reflect the last light of day. Neither rushed to fill the silence, nor to define it. The quiet presence, mutual recognition, and steady acts of kindness were enough. Evelyn realized that emotional growth was not a single moment or gesture, but the accumulation of many small acts, deliberate attention, and consistent respect for boundaries. She had learned that dignity could be cultivated internally and reinforced externally, not by the approval of others, but by the consistency of care she both gave and received. Arthur, too, understood that growth was measured not by declarations or accolades, but by the steady practice of kindness, attentiveness, and presence. Their shared experiences had created a resilient framework, allowing both to navigate life's uncertainties with confidence, dignity, and hope. And as the sky darkened into the soft hues of twilight, Evelyn and Arthur remained on the bench, side by side, quietly acknowledging the consequences and rewards of their emotional growth. The resilience they had cultivated, the dignity they had preserved, and the subtle, sustaining hope they had discovered in each other's presence. Spring in Pinebrook had settled into a gentle rhythm. The streets, once snow-laden, were now lined with buds and early blooms. The lake shimmered in the afternoon light, a mirror to the sky and the slow pulse of daily life. Yet for Evelyn Carter, the world felt subtly different, not because anything had changed dramatically, but because she herself had shifted quietly internally, and in ways the town might never notice. Arthur Bennett remained a steady presence. Not a hero, not a spectacle, not a force demanding attention. Simply there, side by side in the ordinary moments that mattered most. They continued their routines, feeding the birds in the park, tending to the library, checking on neighbors when needed, and exchanging subtle gestures of acknowledgement that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. One evening, the town held its annual Spring Lantern Festival. Lanterns would float along the lake and across the bridge, carried by villagers who whispered wishes into the night sky. Evelyn had long avoided public events like this, expecting them to bring only observation, commentary, or well-meaning pity. Yet Arthur had quietly invited her weeks earlier with a simple note. "No pressure, no expectation, just a seat for you if you wish to join." Evelyn considered the invitation, then set it aside, letting herself think. She realized that attending would not be an act of performance but a choice, a subtle assertion of agency, of presence, of willingness to engage with life despite past grief and lingering caution. When she arrived, the lanterns were already being carried into the lake, soft glows bobbing across the surface like floating constellations. The villagers murmured, children laughed, and couples walked hand in hand. Evelyn noticed the familiar whispers at first, assumptions, skepticism, polite amusement. But she did not hear them for long. She was no longer seeking validation from their judgment. Arthur stood near the bridge holding two lanterns. One he carried for himself and one, the smaller, gentler lantern, he had reserved for her. He did not bow, beckon dramatically, or comment on the town. He simply waited, quiet, patient, steady. Evelyn approached slowly, the soft sound of her boots on the wooden planks blending with the gentle lapping of the lake. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world beyond the bridge seemed to fade. "I saved this one for you," Arthur said softly, voice carrying just enough for her to hear, yet not projecting for the crowd. "Not because you need it, but because some lights are meant to be shared." Evelyn held the lantern, feeling the warmth of the candle and the fragile strength of its paper shell. She did not cry, nor did she make a speech. She simply lifted it beside his, letting the two lights float in tandem, reflecting on the water below. Around them the villagers paused, murmurs quieting as eyes lingered on the pair. Some smiled, some swallowed unspoken judgments, and a few realized belatedly that assumptions had been wrong all along. Evelyn was not fragile. She was not pitiable. She was not too old for connection. She was luminous, not because of the lantern itself, but because of the dignity with which she had chosen to participate in life. As the lanterns drifted, Arthur and Evelyn remained near the bridge. Their hands did not touch, yet the shared understanding was palpable. It was not romance in the dramatic sense. It was the acknowledgement of presence, the recognition of endurance, the quiet permission to hope. Afterward they walked slowly along the lakeside, letting the glow of distant lanterns fade into twilight. Evelyn spoke softly. "I never imagined moments like this were possible, not after Thomas." Arthur nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Neither did I after Margaret, yet here we are, and perhaps that's enough." The town did not understand fully. Many would return to their routines, whisper assumptions, and misinterpret subtle gestures. But Evelyn and Arthur no longer required public comprehension. They had discovered a truth more enduring than recognition. Companionship, dignity, and hope could exist quietly, sustained by consistency and respect. In the following weeks, they continued their rituals, visiting the park, tending to the library, exchanging small tokens of recognition like stones, flowers, and notes. Each act carried layers of meaning: acknowledgement of the past, attention to the present, and gentle permission to anticipate the future without expectation. Evelyn noticed the transformation within herself. She no longer flinched at judgment. She no longer felt that life had concluded because others had decided her story was finished. She had reclaimed agency over her own narrative, embracing both grief and joy in measured, patient increments. Arthur, too, reflected on the change. He understood that his presence had not fixed her life, nor had hers fixed his. They had not erased loss, and neither had replaced love. They had simply cultivated a shared space in which resilience, attentiveness, and subtle care could thrive. On a quiet afternoon, they sat together on the park bench as sunlight filtered through budding leaves. Birds chirped softly, and the lake rippled gently. Evelyn looked at Arthur, the weight of decades of grief softened but not forgotten. "Do you think we will always be like this?" she asked. Arthur smiled faintly, the edges of his eyes crinkling. "I don't know. I can't promise tomorrow or even next week, but I know that today and these moments are real. That is enough." Evelyn nodded. She realized that hope need not be certain to exist. It could reside in small gestures, shared silences, and deliberate presence. It could emerge without guarantee, without declaration, without external permission. The two of them remained on the bench, side by side, neither speaking for several minutes. The world continued, children laughing, neighbors passing by, the lake reflecting light and shadow. And yet in that quiet space, Evelyn and Arthur discovered something rare. A sense of completeness not defined by grand gestures, not contingent on public acknowledgement, and not constrained by age or past grief. Evenings grew longer, and they continued to cultivate the small rituals that had become central to their connection. A stone arranged here, a flower placed there, a note tucked gently into a book. Each act reinforced their quiet bond, a reminder that life could still hold meaning, dignity, and human connection even when unobserved. The town, largely unaware of the depth of this transformation, continued its routines, its whispers, and its assumptions. Yet for Evelyn and Arthur, the approval of others had become irrelevant. They had discovered that emotional fulfillment could exist quietly, sustained by attention, empathy, and shared endurance. One evening, as the first fireflies emerged in the warming twilight, Evelyn reflected on her journey. She remembered Thomas, her decades of service, the town's judgments, and her long years of private grief. She thought of Arthur, the subtle gestures, the patient companionship, the quiet acts of kindness that asked for nothing in return. And she realized she was not too old for connection. She was not defined by loss or age or the assumptions of others. She had, at last, reclaimed the ability to exist fully, to receive, to hope, and to participate in life on her own terms. Arthur, walking beside her, noticed the gentle shift in her demeanor. There was a calm strength in her step, a quiet assurance in her gaze, and a subtle warmth in her presence. He understood that the moments they shared were not dependent on a guaranteed future, not contingent on declarations, and not diminished by past grief. They were sufficient, and that sufficiency carried profound meaning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park and lake. Evelyn and Arthur paused, standing silently, side by side. No promises were made, no future was guaranteed, yet the world seemed to hold its breath in acknowledgement of their quiet presence. Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the first stars appearing in the dusk sky. She did not know what the next day would bring, what challenges might arise, or how the town would perceive her ongoing life. But she knew that she had discovered something vital, the capacity to hope, to be seen, and to continue participating in life with dignity and subtle joy. Arthur reached out, not to hold, not to claim, but to brush a hand lightly against the edge of hers. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of their shared journey. Evelyn did not recoil. She did not overreact. She simply allowed the moment to exist, fragile and real, unannounced to the world and unburdened by expectation. Together, they walked back toward the village, the air soft and filled with the sounds of evening. Lanterns from earlier festivities still floated faintly across the lake, tiny reflections in the water that shimmered and shifted with the gentle wind. The lights mirrored the ongoing rhythm of their lives, fragile, luminous, and quietly sustained by attention and care. Evelyn understood in that moment that life's most profound lessons often arrive quietly, through presence, through recognition, through small acts that accumulate over time. Love, companionship, and hope are not bound by age or public expectation. They exist in the subtle spaces between gestures, silences, and shared understanding. As night fell, she and Arthur parted at the edge of their usual park path. No promises were spoken, no declarations made. Yet the knowledge of each other's presence lingered, not as an obligation, not as a guarantee, but as a sustaining reality. Evelyn walked home slowly, carrying the quiet warmth of acknowledgement in her heart. She looked at the lantern-lit lake from a distance and felt a strange, gentle courage. The courage to continue existing fully, to accept kindness, and to allow herself the subtle permission to hope. The town of Pinebrook would continue its routines. Whispered assumptions and polite judgments would persist. Yet Evelyn knew that she had, at last, reclaimed her story, not for anyone else, not for recognition, but for herself. And that, she understood, was enough. Somewhere behind her, Arthur turned toward his own home, the knowledge of shared endurance guiding his steps. Neither could predict the future, nor control the world around them. But both had discovered a profound truth. Hope does not require certainty, connection does not demand declaration, and human dignity can flourish quietly, even in the absence of applause. And so the story ends not with closure, not with promises, not with guarantees. It ends with quiet warmth, shared presence, and the subtle light of understanding that continues to illuminate both their lives, fragile, luminous, and enduring. If this story moved you, what lesson are you taking from it today?